we'll have to start by showing the American people what's truly at stake here. Because, at the end of the day, the Ukraine and Russia have lost about 300,000 men killed in less than a year and a half of war. We lost 10,000 brave Americans in 20 years of conflict. And my concern is that a military that's built on social progressivism and DEI is not going to be a military, and it's not going to be a culture that can sustain those kinds of losses if America is ever in that kind of situation. And if we don't reclaim the military as an institution that can fight for a worthy cause, even if it means that kind of cost, then the future is very dark for America.
Howdy everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and I'm joined by
Nick Solheim, the COO of American Moment.
For a rare joint episode, Nick and I have been across the country from each other. It feels like most of the days that an episode is needed to be taped, but we are back with an old friend today. We had on William Thibeau, who is the director of the American Military Project at the DC branch of the Claremont Institute. Before we get to that, as always, make sure to go to AmericanMoment.org. There you can find the backlog of this podcast. You can find our ongoing programs. You could sign up for AM Fridays, our summer lunch series on Capitol Hill, meant for interns and junior staff, where we're bringing in the best public policy experts on a constellation of issues to talk about the cutting edge of an America First agenda. You can find AmCanon, the coalition of books, essays, podcasts, YouTube videos, and more that we put out, as well as everything else we have cooking. But today we had on William Thibeau, who is the director of the American Military Project at the Center for the American Way of Life. The American Military Project is to systematically expose, evaluate, and eliminate the manifestations of wokeness in the personnel, programs, and policies of the United States military. In doing so, the project will cultivate the philosophy and policy required to remake a military genuinely formed for and committed to the nation's security and defense. William is a veteran of the Heritage Foundation, the American Conservative, and Palantir Technologies. He is a Catholic husband and father of three, originally from Illinois, who now lives in Northern Virginia. As a graduate of Fordham University, Will served as an Army Ranger during multiple deployments to the Middle East and has commented on technology policy for the Daily Signal and has appeared on Steve Bannon's War Room and Fox News. He is a dear friend of Nick and I's. We've gotten to know him and his family over the years. He is brilliant and knows exactly what needs to be done to tear out, root, and branch the corruption of the United States military. It was a really informative episode. It was a moving episode. I mean, what do you think about it, Nick?
Yeah, it was fantastic. Very depressing to see how far deep the problem goes, but definitely motivating to create a new class of generals and officers to serve in the military.
So we'll go now to William Thibeau. Will, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Saurabh, Nick, thanks for having me.
We always like to hear about how our guests got to where they are today, and your story, I think, is particularly illustrative because it informs a lot of the work that you do today. Tell us that tale. Where did Will Thibeau come from?
I started as a kid in the suburbs of Chicago who didn't grow up with much in the way of physical rigor or suffering, and so I created it through dreams of being a frontline soldier in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. My friend and I would crawl through brush near our houses and see who could detect whom first. And somehow we told ourselves that would be preparation for grueling military service to come. It took me a little bit of time to get there. I went to Fordham University. I realized I couldn't pay for college at the height of the financial crisis and joined the Army ROTC program, so I could stay at Fordham. When I graduated, I was an infantry officer in the Army, served in Washington State, tried out and was selected to serve in the 75th Ranger Regiment in Fort Benning, Georgia. And as a Ranger, I deployed to Iraq a number of times. Subsequently, and along that way, I met my wife, Michelle, who is also an Army officer. She would say I'm ROTC scum. She was a West Point graduate. And, before
so she's the brains. Okay, got it.
I don't know. Yeah, well, we might get into this, but she's a West Point graduate. I was not, and she was going to Afghanistan. I deployed to Iraq, and that gave me my first taste of not only what it was like to deploy myself, which I loved and I could do for the rest of my life, but what it was like to love someone who was deployed, which is a lot harder. We got married and for some mutual truce agreed to leave the Army together. And, that took about a year. But when we left the Army after having our first baby, we moved to Washington, D.C., a few weeks shy of the start of the great pandemic of 2020. And I was working at a defense technology company in Georgetown and eager to continue my service, to serve an institution that I loved, that being the military, and to do so with great technology. But things started to change for me when the Afghanistan drawdown took place in August of 2021, not because the drawdown was problematic in of itself, but because it revealed 20 years of deception and lies that anyone could have told you was there. Anyone could have observed the house of cards and explained the Afghan military wouldn't last a few days after the American government left. But somehow we had convinced ourselves around this town that we were building something that could last in Kabul and the surrounding provinces. The technology company in which I was working was, very ingrained throughout that war, but we left. The government and the Afghan military collapsed over the course of a weekend, and with it, I think, came a lot of disillusionment for me and for a lot of veterans. And I realized that even if I worked at a company which sought to serve the institutions of our country, it would be fruitless if those institutions were the kinds that could tell lies to the American people for 20 years with no accountability. Everyone who did that still has their jobs, and the rest of us are wondering when the next misadventure will take place. So I had a conversation with you and with both of you, and figured out the best path forward in conservative politics, and through a little bit of a schizophrenic but a really blessed path. I'm now working at the Claremont Institute, where we have the American Military Project, where we kind of consider what the institution of the American military should look like if it is going to be one that is worthy of the public trust and also capable of winning wars in the future.
So tell me a little bit more about that project. What are the inflection points over the last few years that have inspired that more critical assessment of the state of our military? How bad are things?
I will say all this without any animus towards individuals that I served with, and many of whom are still wearing the uniform. I think it will be the best men I ever knew. I for some reason, I feel obligated to put that disclaimer out there. But I think the story begins with Bill Clinton's administration. He came into office in January of 1993 after having campaigned on the promise to allow homosexuals to serve in the military, which was previously illegal. He was inaugurated, and when he got to the White House, what welcomed him were the resignation letters of every Marine Corps general, and I think most Army generals, who were reacting to his planned rule change that would allow homosexuals to serve. He backed down. Ultimately, the don't ask, don't tell policy would be a political compromise that resulted. But the more meaningful change, perhaps the more meaningful change, was the revolution in military personnel affairs that followed from this defiant, I think, moral move of Marine and Army generals. He started a policy, you can call it a policy, I think it can only be described as that, of making sure the General Officer Corps would be one that is ultimately compliant and committed to fulfilling the worldview of liberal internationalism, which I think many would see Bill Clinton as ushering into our government writ large after the fall of the Soviet Union. That's continued. I'll talk about two ways in which that's manifested itself, that both have to do with military officer professional development. When the best and the brightest, as I already alluded to, typically go to our service academies, Navy, West Point, the Air Force Academy in Colorado. Those service academies more closely resemble four-year degree conferring institutions, and we know what has happened to the university system, than a military academy during the year. and they're good in some ways, but to put one fine point on it, at West Point, you can minor in diversity and inclusion studies. And then the next month after you graduate with that degree, you're supposed to, tie your boots tight and learn how to lead soldiers in combat. So perhaps you could suggest that there's been an ideological capture of that institution, but it's true. The propensity of liberal arts degrees has grown since the 90s. And the number of non-military professors has also grown at West Point. And there's been a playbook, and it's happened at the military academies. Along the way, for military officers, there's now the expectation certain men go to civilian institutions of higher education for master's, even doctorate degrees, at not just kind of as nice professional development opportunities, but as gates that merit promotion and accolades for their military service. So it's very typical for the best and brightest who are at, say 10 years in service to go to Johns Hopkins or the Harvard Kennedy School, or even UNC Chapel Hill to get your MBA. Again, for the degree itself, but also because that degree, the military's decided, means something for a person's potential to lead at higher capacities of organizational leadership. I think it's not accidental. And I think the fact there's a conflation between military promotions and the university system is problematic. There's a lot in there. I think it's worth talking about how, Bill Clinton's project continued apace through the Bush administration. They were, I think, more interested in starting and fighting the war on terror. Donald Rumsfeld was infamously ignorant of generals, even had a lot of apathy and antipathy towards generals. And so he didn't pay much attention to how they were formed and who was serving in those ranks of responsibility. And certainly President Obama, like he did with much of the federal government, picked the mantle up from Bill Clinton and accelerated the change. And I think, some could say our fate, at least our interim fate, was sealed when he changed the law to allow women to serve in all combat roles without restriction in all branches of the military. To me, that was the ultimate acknowledgement that the military exists as an institution for self-actualization that is devoid from the realities of physical life and ground combat. That's continued, and I think we'll talk about a few more ways, but suffice to say, I don't know that the Trump administration reversed course at all.
So can you lay out for me at this point, how exactly does the military hierarchy work in terms of selection and promotion? Because like any system, I think that is as explanatory as anything for why we've ended up where we are today.
At the beginning, it starts with showing up to work on time, making sure you shave your face in the morning, which I've stopped doing, and being a credible leader to soldiers of a very different walk of life. And that's all well and good, but the important principle is your boss, another military officer, chooses you. And ultimately, another military officer chooses your boss. And so, if I'm an officer with 2 years of experience, typically I'm being evaluated by an officer with 20 years of experience. And obviously that's a big difference, but that's the importance on which the military places kind of seniority when choosing the next generation of leaders. But ultimately, and I should say, every officer promotion, even from second lieutenant to first lieutenant, is a promotion that is technically approved by Congress, by an act of Congress. That becomes more formal when we start talking about adding stars to your uniform, and it's generals and admirals who are being selected and promoted, where each general or admiral of any rank from 1-star to 4-star technically receives a vote by Congress. And for 3- and 4-star generals, all of those are assigned to a specific job. For example, that a 4-star general is promoted to command European command, the European theater of operations. Previously, that's not always the case for 1 and 2-star officers, where they're just promoted, given responsibility, but not necessarily an explicit job. But nonetheless, they're chosen by Congress. I won't necessarily say this with personal knowledge, but many would say that it becomes as much of a political game as anything when you start thinking about being a general or a flag officer, as they say, because it is about your ability to fulfill the mission of the U.S. military. But what I'm not saying is you're not necessarily selected because you're going to do what your civilian officials tell you to do. And I think that's something that's kind of gone awry here, is we've lost a sense of accountability between genuine military leadership or genuine civilian leadership of a military that is, constitutionally bound, at least, to do what civilians tell them to do.
Can you lay out the pipeline timeline? Someone who's becoming a general today, when do they first enter the service? Because I just think at each of these moments in time, these selection criteria have and promotion pressures have mutated and changed over time. And so in some cases, I feel like the cake that's coming out of the oven today was first put in, X number of years ago. And what does that tell us about why we might be getting the results that we're getting today? It
certainly is. And in line of the timeline that I explained about kind of the revolution of military personnel management, the generals, the people who are up for consideration for general officer for the first time in their careers today were probably second lieutenants, first time officers in 1995 or 1996, 27 to 28 years in service, and you get your first look.
So this is the fruits of the Clinton administration.
Right, exactly. We're starting to see it. And President Biden and Secretary Austin changed the military policy earlier this year to allow taxpayer dollars, Defense Department money, to pay for travel and abortion-related services for service members and their dependents. Whereas about 30 years ago, we saw letters of resignation, supposed moral outrage on a genuine moral issue, that being homosexuals serving in the military. We didn't see any letters of resignation earlier this year in 2023, and perhaps that's just one sign of how far we've come.
I'm curious about what this looked like prior to the Clinton years. You had MacArthur famously, saying that we needed to drop a nuke on China. You had the Joint Chiefs, while JFK was president, saying that we needed to invade Cuba. It seems to me that there's frequently a bit of a disconnect in what military officers think is appropriate, or at least there used to be, and what civilians, presidents think are appropriate. What kind of class did these people come from previously? How were they motivated to make decisions and that sort of thing?
You hit well on it, Nick, that there's always been this kind of impetus for professional military officers to impose their will on the foreign policy decisions of administration. And that kind of had troubling manifestations during President Kennedy's administration. Honestly, I think if you're looking for a book on just how bad this can get, H.R. McMaster, wrote a really great doctoral thesis explaining exactly this. His book called Dereliction of Duty is a really kind of excellent tome on how military officers fail their duty to serve civilian leaders. But the change that I want to highlight, kind of truly starting with the end of World War II, and then cementing itself in the years before Vietnam, was the transition from our military as one of citizen soldiers to a professional military class that existed as an institution of itself, regardless of whether the military was at war. You can't call our army anymore one of citizen soldiers. They are professional soldiers. And, even when you serve, when I served, I lived to uphold a profession of arms that was on the surface very positive and worthy, but actually transformational based on how the military was founded when our country was founded, and even how our military fought some of its greatest successes, if that's how you're going to view World War II. Korea, and again by Vietnam, that had changed to a permanent standing army that existed as an institution unto itself. And what we've seen is kind of the authority, the cultural adoration and respect, and the budget that has come to accompany that permanent military and a permanent officer class that serves that military. I think oftentimes with increasing independence and even defiance of the civilian leaders that it's obligated to serve. And I'll just kind of one aside, although it's perhaps not worth a whole segment, that this is why it is so problematic that General Mattis went from wearing a Marine Corps uniform to being the Secretary of Defense, why Lloyd Austin spent a few years on the board of Raytheon and then served as the civilian Secretary of Defense.
I was going to ask about this, like the waiver of who can serve as Secretary of Defense. I mean, how many times has it been used now in the 2000s? 4 times at least, right?
I think
Powell,
so, yeah.
Mattis, Kelly. Well, Kelly was made Chief of Staff. But like the dereliction of civilian leaders of authorities relating to our national security to the permanent military class, I mean, I think is one of the great stories of our time. And then you have this class of people that people have invested a lot of authority and credibility in that are simultaneously being corrupted through all these trends that you're talking about in the military chain of command. It just seems like all of these problems are coming home to roost in a big way, and our ability to seriously assess military leaders has never been as weak as it is now.
Right. And I think there's a vein here that is worth telling based on who we make our heroes. In the Civil War, one of my favorite heroes is Joshua Chamberlain, who is a colonel in the Union Army, who was a college professor in Maine, and he led this famous counterattack on the southern flank of the Union defense on the second day of Gettysburg that likely saved the war in the Union's favor. But he was famous because he was a professor, and he was there leading citizen soldiers kind of despite all odds. Who was our hero of the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War? It was David Petraeus, a professional soldier, but one who had gotten all the credentials and the accolades that we deem to be distinguishing for civilians. He had a PhD from Princeton, I think. He wrote books. He had his own foray with a biographer and classified secrets. But he was a man worthy of the utmost distinction, and he was, I think, given one of those waivers to lead the CIA, and has used his uniform as a professional soldier beyond anything else to kind of leverage foreign policy comments and opinions that have some status. Yeah. But in reality, we should always be looking to the people who are theoretically here to represent us as the ones dictating those left and right limits, and then it's the military's job to fulfill them. And I'll say that in response, the military's typically been given a lot of leeway for governing themselves. Yeah, right. We've entrusted the chain of command to deal with matters of discipline. Adultery is still illegal under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, right? It'd be wonderful if our society reflected that. But the point is
that actually enforced?
It is. I mean, it's kind of hard to prove sometimes, but it is enforced, and for good reason. But the point is that there should have been this agreement that the military is an institution set apart for itself to govern itself, so it can execute really dangerous tasks when civilian leaders tell them what to do. What we've found, and again, I think a huge turning point was Barack Obama's rule change to allow women to serve in combat roles. Is we've started to see the military as an institution that should reflect America in some way, and I think that's had a lot of disastrous consequences for civil-military relations and the credibility of the institution.
A related trend to the elevation of authority of military leaders into political commentators, essentially, is their elevation into sort of self-help gurus as well. I'm curious if you have any takes on like the Seal Bro phenomenon of writing self-help books and like selling ads on podcasts and that kind of thing. I mean, what's going on there? It seems to have only proliferated in the last decade.
Yeah. Well, it should say something about Navy SEALs first and foremost. But in all seriousness, I do think that perhaps kind of speaks at the broader cultural trend that guys. Let's talk. Men grew up probably around the time the three of us grew up without much inclination for physical vigor and suffering unless we really sought it out. And I think you get to your 30s or, maybe your 40s and you realized that you've sat at a desk all your life, whether in public school or in a consulting company, and you want to taste, we called it tasting the rainbow, when, we were in a particularly arduous training exercise. And there's a market for people who have done that. And it's a market to read their books, to go through their physical training programs, and to suffer just like the SEALs did. I will say the interesting thing about BUDS, which is the Navy SEALs kind of pinnacle training program, is that you always get at least 3 meals a day during BUDS, which wasn't always the case during Army Ranger School. But perhaps that's another podcast. So I just think it's part of this valorization of the military. I think it's warranted in some cases. You guys know better than me, but you meet a lot of young men around this town who have done nothing but come from their suburban upbringing and think that the biggest stress in their life is waking up at 9 a.m. for Sunday brunch. And I think ideally the military as an institution should exist for men to sharpen themselves, to learn how to suffer, and to do something with their 20s. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's kind of become sad that conservatives, at least, I think have a lot of reason to wonder if it can be that institution where their sons can serve with distinction and also serve a cause that matters and is just.
Isn't that in tension with what you said earlier, though, that the military should not be a tool of self-actualization?
Well, right. But I think the reason that it's valuable, or that it can be valuable, is that the military is a place where you subjugate your interests to the collective needs of your unit, where you give up food and sleep, if you're in the Army, to better yourself and to be a small part of a team that is oriented on a collective mission that hopefully matters and hopefully is just. I think some of that's coming into question.
What did generals used to do, like after they retired? Because now they get to be on the board of Raytheon and write these self-help books. But what did they used to do?
I'm not exactly sure. I think university professorships were often very common. Dwight Eisenhower ran for president, and again, that was kind of a sea change as far as I'm concerned. But even he wasn't the first, of course. There is something that's changed here, where you become this armchair expert for political and foreign policy commentary that I don't know has always been around, but. I think, if you're a general who retired, you saw yourself as kind of a statesman meant to be apart from the political calculus of that day and age. And the really scary thing is I think that's starting to change while you're in uniform, is that there's some justification or some need that senior military officers get to be arbiters of political right and wrong while they're in the uniform. And that's troubling.
And one of the primary examples of such a thing is one Mark Milley, who will be leaving soon. Tell us why Mark Milley is so awful. I think it's something that's generally understood on the right of center, but from the informed perspective that you have, I would love to hear some of the most perfidious examples of the things he's done.
I don't know that I have a unique insight into why he has uniquely compromised the institution of the military. But if you're even to believe kind of half of the reporting that's come out about his role during the last year of the Trump administration, you are to believe that that the highest ranking military officer in our land sought an independent operating ability to affect foreign policy and domestic policy decision-making in the way that he sought was appropriate, not based on what his boss, Donald Trump at the time, told him to do. And, kind of it changes by the day with President Trump's recent indictment and, plans for war with different countries. And, what exactly was General Milley trying to communicate to the Chinese when he wanted to warn them of President Trump's supposed instability?
Can you tease out that story? Because that to me was the biggest example of a discrepancy between the grave reality of something that happened versus how little media coverage it got in the last several years.
Basically, in early 2021, January, I think even before January 6th, but certainly after, General Milley had communications with his Chinese counterparts that, as the reporting would lead us to indicate, built a back channel in the event of a military crisis with China. So, if you take things at face value, General Milley was worried President Trump would act rashly and order military action against China. And he wanted there to be an off switch to deload tension so that wouldn't reach its fullest conclusion. Even if you take that story at face value.
That's a bit of treason right there.
Well, right. And it signifies that a senior military officer, the most senior military officer, wanted to act independent of the president and the rest of the, military apparatus, the intelligence community, to exercise foreign policy as he saw fit.
So that's not very norms of him.
Well, no, I mean, to say the least, it's not. And this is, I think, a good distinction between that everyone should understand about senior military officers, especially the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So all the service chiefs, the 4-star generals who lead the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, and then the chairman, Mark Milley in this case, they don't have any operational control over any soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine. They serve as principal advisors to the president, but then as chiefs responsible for the readiness and resourcing of their components of the armed services. But those men, the Joint Chiefs will never tell a soldier what to do. They'll never tell a boat to go somewhere.
Who does?
So, I mean, ultimately it's the president, it's the Secretary of Defense, and then it is what are called combatant command commanders, who typically have geographic or operational responsibilities into which certain components fall.
PACOM, CENTCOM.
Exactly, right. And so, the PACOM commander, Pacific Command commander, if there were a conflict in the Pacific, would have ultimate operational control over which fleet of destroyers, sailed to Taiwan.
So why did the Joint Chiefs exist?
They exist for advice and counsel to the president. It is the choice. I would go on missions to kill or capture the leadership of ISIS in Iraq. And so typically for our missions, the Joint Chiefs, and maybe even someone they delegate, would recommend or give options to the president to do so with a raid of Army Rangers or an airstrike. Right. And they give him those military options. They give him the potential consequences of each and perhaps a recommendation. But it is just that, it's advice. And they have responsibility to make sure that that things are in order for either option to be carried out to success, but they are not independent actors who make that decision themselves.
So did Milley ever face any, I mean, I know the answer to this, but maybe you can talk about why, ever face any consequences for this?
I don't think so. He, as Saurabh alluded to, he's leaving his role as chairman of the Joint Chiefs kind of after the normal 3 or 4 year course of, or the normal 3 or 4 year tour of duty. He's received some pressure from Congress, but certainly no punitive action that would formally suggest he's done anything wrong.
Internal to military hierarchy is serving on the Joint Chiefs and then ultimately being the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Is that widely considered like the most prestigious job in the military, or is there kind of offshoot branches where like, no, PACOM, CENTCOM, like there's a case to be made that that's the most prestigious job? Or because I think it's relevant because it indicates which way the prestige flows, and that has implications for what kinds of people seek out what kinds of roles.
Probably on average, I imagine it would be considered most prestigious by most senior military officers. But that's not universal. For example, when the Afghanistan war was still hot, the 4-star in command of forces in Afghanistan was probably one of the most desired positions, if not the most, because you had operational control of soldiers at war. And that
was our most active war.
Right, exactly. And that at the time, that was a 4-star command on the level of a PACOM or a CENTCOM, with direct reporting to the president and the secretary of defense. Mm-hmm. So, it depends. It's a big job. Mm-hmm. I think all else equal, you should consider it the most prestigious.
And so there's a new guy they're putting up for it. Tell us about one CQ Brown.
Right. General Brown is currently the Air Force Chief of Staff. He was nominated to be the Air Force Chief of Staff by President Trump. And he was confirmed by the Senate on a vote of 98-0. This came after General Brown spoke very passionately of the Air Force's job to be a force for racial justice after George Floyd died. And again, he was nominated after that. And he said something interesting during his nomination hearing. He wanted senators to hold him accountable for two things: the readiness of Air Force aircraft and the readiness of Air Force pilots to be able to get in the air at the drop of a hat. In other words, so if the need arises and the call comes and a pilot needs to get in the cockpit and fly, what are the chances that pilot and that airplane can get in the air and fly capably? Typically, the minimum acceptable threshold for readiness for both pilots and aircraft is about 70%, meaning 7 out of every 10 aircraft need to be able to get off the ground and fly. 7 out of every 10 pilots need to get in that aircraft and fly it well. Both metrics
is that multiplicative? So about half total?
No, that's independent. Yeah, and each of those numbers are below 60%. So just about half of.
So he failed on his own terms.
Right, exactly. Failed on his own terms,
which is why he's getting a promotion.
I think it might have to do with some of the other things I'll get into, yeah. But let's just lay it out there. He is, I think, a political officer. He has seen it. He has stated countless times that he sees it as his job to make DEI part of the Air Force's DNA. He signed a memo on August 9th of 2022 with the Space Force leadership and with the Secretary of the Air Force, obviously all Biden appointees, that established racial and gender quotas for the Air Force Officer Corps. Now, even if you're someone who thinks that diversity goals are part of military personnel policy, you would think that racial quotas to even dictate to the fact that white men should only make up 43% of Air Force officers, whereas right now white men make up about 60% of Air Force officers. You would think that be a bridge too far, but it's kind of come with shocking silence as that's become policy for the Air Force. Just 6 weeks ago in front of the House Armed Services Committee, he vigorously and with a straight face defended the Air Force Academy's ban on the offensive terms mother and father, and was insistent that was part of what made a cohesive, inclusive team. There's been something interesting that happened at Air Force Flight School along the way. There's not necessarily evidence yet that this is continuing, but at one point the Air Force wasn't happy with the diversity of the pilots of fighters and bombers. So think the F-18, the B-2, kind of the quintessential Air Force aircraft were being flown in the Air Force's eyes by too many white men, and so the Air Force created a pilot program where Air Force flight school classes were kind of the normal demographic breakdown of the country, or the typical demographic breakdown of a flight school class, 60+% white men and on down, and replaced that class with something they called America's class, which directly reflected the racial and gender demographics of the nation. They had to stop those flight school classes because those were not producing enough qualified pilots to fly the most complicated and important aircraft in the Air Force arsenal. But again, this was a program directed from Air Force leadership, so you can take all of this into account with General Brown, and maybe if all was well, we'd have to just kind of hold our noses and vote yes and support his nomination to replace Mark Milley. But something is clearly wrong. One last vignette from December of last year to May of this past year, all B-2 bombers, which are kind of the Batwing, really sleek looking aircraft, are only I always get this wrong, our only stealth-capable nuclear bomber. All of those were grounded, meaning they weren't allowed to fly for the first time in the history of that platform's existence. They're up in the air now. I think I saw them at an air show online the other day.
Why were they grounded?
But we don't know. And supposedly there was an accident, but I think it has to do perhaps with the fact that the Air Force also released in 2022 the statistic that Air Force bomber pilots, the ones with really long missions and supposedly intense training requirements, only fly 7.1 hours per month. I think a lot of Delta pilots will surpass that.
Got to create more time for diversity trainings, Will.
Well, that's the question. What else are they doing? I had an old friend of mine text me from his 4-hour Pride Month training at a base in Louisiana the other day.
What does a Pride Month training entail? I hope it's not practicum.
Well, it entails the insistence that someone tolerate all viewpoints and all lifestyles.
I see.
I wonder if that includes traditional Catholics, but I don't want to ask in some level. So my point is all is not well. But I think the scariest thing is I don't know if there's a vote against General Brown in the Senate. I don't know if there's a single one. I'm hoping someone will be willing to ask him a hard question with all of the evidence, that I think can upset defense hawks. I think it can upset culture warriors. I'm wondering if that's enough to get someone to ask him a hard question during his Senate hearing. But we should assume that he's going to be the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, even with all of this.
What would it take? I mean, is it a 60 vote threshold for him to get confirmed?
I don't think so. Okay. But I'm not a whiz on Senate procedure. Perhaps there's a way where that is the threshold, but ultimately, I think it's a simple majority confirmation vote, much like judges are voted on now.
So what? I mean, this seems to be a classical case of failing upward. But what would we need to look for in somebody to lead the Air Force in a future conservative administration? Obviously, hopefully, flying more than 7 hours per month. But what can be done to improve readiness and get rid of a lot of these like quotas, gender trainings, that sort of thing?
Well, perhaps a litmus test is just the first step. I think we need uniformed military officers who are willing to get rid of diversity, any instance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in military leadership. I think we need military officers who are willing to rid ourselves of the belief that the military exists as an institution for every walk of life. It's not. One other frustration I have, I think every Republican presidential candidate, even the quote unquote moderate ones, are justifiably upset over the possibility that an American high school girl might one day run the 400-meter dash against a boy. But no one seems to be upset about the fact that same high school girl, when she turns 18, will be able to sign up and jump into an infantry trench line and fight and die, under the same conditions as men, as a soldier or as a Marine. And I'm wondering if we can recover a little bit of that cultural indignation over the roles of men and women in our society and in our military, because I don't think the numbers lie. Every service component except the Marine Corps will miss recruiting goals for the second year in a row.
Why do you think that's happening?
I think it's a few reasons. I do think that 20 years of the war on terror has given the kinds of people who typically sent their sons to fight those wars the sense that their military service is disconnected from the interests of the American people. And that is, I think, this fundamental mistrust that we have to solve. And I don't know if that will be able to happen in another administration. But I think the second kind of bucket of reasons is a fear or a distrust of politicized military leadership. The Army in 2021 and 2022 leaned hardest into appealing to folks of different lifestyles. They ran ads, hopefully infamously, but maybe famously, on the soldiers who had two moms and how the Army was the place for them. And the Army missed recruiting goals by at least 25% last year. And they're going to do so by at least that much again. And keep in mind, the services set their own recruiting goals, and they also decide when they tell Congress if they've missed those goals or not.
So these numbers are worse than they were.
I think they're much worse. There are some people who've come forward for our project who said that they are much worse than the services would officially lead on. But those together, a distrust of our leaders' ability to get us involved in conflicts that genuinely support America and to represent institutions that are at the very least apolitical, much less an institution that can be a bastion for forming good American men for what's to come. That's why this is happening. I don't think it has to do with the economy because we've met recruiting goals in different waves for the last 35 years until now.
You were talking earlier about this kind of timeline on which you make a general. Frequently takes anywhere between 20 to 40 years from joining up. Seems like we're a long way away from actually having generals that reflect the beliefs of the average American. What's the framework by which you kind of build this cadre of people, and is anybody doing that now?
Well, we're going to start, and it's going to take serious, kind of multifaceted, a rear guard march through the institutions, if you will. That's like, a military tactic. Obviously, the left has picked up Gramsci's mantle and marched through the institutions, including the military, and we have to work our way back through and seize them ourselves. But I think it starts with the generals that the next potential conservative administration will promote now. Herein lies kind of an interesting opportunity that Senator Tommy Tuberville of Alabama has provided our project at Claremont and hopefully the conservative movement writ large to genuinely examine and scrutinize the kinds of people that are coming up for promotion in front of the Senate. I think, as I mentioned, every military officer, second lieutenant captain, all the way up to 4-star general, his promotion comes through Congress and is approved by Congress. Every general or flag officer gets a vote. 9 times out of 10, unless you're becoming a 4-star general for a specific job that we talked about, service chief, component commander, where you get a hearing and a vote, your nomination is approved via unanimous consent. It's offered by some senator and no one objects, and you get your next star and you move on to your next job. Senator Tuberville, in the wake of the Pentagon paying for abortion-related services for service members and their dependents, decided that he would exercise a hold on all DOD nominations coming forward. And I think that hold has been in place since February 9th of this year. And at this point, over 250 generals and admirals are pending confirmation for their promotion.
And there's no way that is dispositive for their ability to actually get it, because it takes 3 days of floor time to actually confirm a nominee one at a time, unless you're operating under UC. And
exactly.
so he has functionally stopped the military promotion in his tracks, and he deserves a ton of praise for it from my perspective.
I think he does too. And to my mind, the cause of abortion and the Pentagon deciding to have a hand in the extermination of babies in the womb is reason enough to do this. And the fact that it's energized, I think, to some extent, J.D. Vance to do the same for Department of Justice nominees is hopefully a sign of growing gumption, let's say, to make it more true. But the reason that I'm happy is because it gives me a chance, it gives our project a chance to highlight how not all nominees to be generals or admirals in the military should be treated with, unfailing adoration and respect. There's a story 5 weeks ago at this point where the Navy naturally is paying sailors to be drag queens as part of a recruiting effort. And the Daily Caller did this great work.
It's so over.
The Daily Caller did this great work. Michaela Burrow's done a lot of work that I've been highlighting without giving her credit. But she did this great work where this drag queen got his start doing drag shows on the USS Ronald Reagan in 2017. Donald Trump was president in 2017. So, again, like we have to reclaim kind of the mantle of using personnel to affect the kind of change that we want in the military, just like you both and others in the movement are doing so for political appointees. But again, he got his start, this drag queen, I think his name is Poppy Daniels, some ludicrous stage name as well. He got his start on the USS Ronald Reagan, a nuclear powered aircraft carrier, with really important jobs. And, I got to thinking, I'm like, okay, well, if you're a nuclear powered aircraft carrier commander, an officer in charge of it, you're probably going to be an admiral in 3 years, and then you're going to be up to be promoted again in another 3 years. And so that puts us right about now. And so I looked up who the admiral was in charge of the USS Ronald Reagan in 2017 and 2018 when the drag queen got his start. And it turns out that this admiral is held up for promotion by Senator Tommy Tuberville. And I don't know what's going to happen to this guy's promotion. He might get his second star and, we'll have to call it good. But isn't this at least a chance to highlight the fact that many of these generals and admirals are political animals seeking a certain worldview to be manifest at the highest ranks of the military?
What's this guy's name?
His name's Admiral Michael Donnelly.
Okay.
On paper, he is qualified. He's a pilot. He's done well at every tour of his command. But when he was commander of an aircraft carrier, he let drag shows happen. And I'm not saying he was the one who kind of signed off on and gave approval, but at the very least, I'm hoping that our effort, and we have some deets on a lot more, will cause a change in calculus for up and coming colonels, rear admirals who want to be promoted, but who realize that their permission of degeneracy will be, disastrous for their careers. And ultimately, we know people have to lose their jobs.
So all the hacks in D.C. instantly started screeching that this was going to cause the American military to totally collapse, and we're going to lose a war, and millions of Americans are going to die because this is going on. Can you just explain why it's not presumably that cataclysmic that Senator Tuberville has put these holds?
Well, I mean, for one thing, I don't know that there's any military policy that prevents, maybe for some of these jobs, I don't know authoritatively, but you can often move someone into their subsequent role without the according promotion. And that's been, I imagine that could be the case, even if that's the policy the military isn't following now. And it's not as if everyone outside of these 250 admirals and generals isn't going to work. Everyone else is still being evaluated. Everyone else is still theoretically expected to get their flying hours and their time on the range to be proficient. I haven't really heard a credible reason why, this scrutiny can't happen. And, that's the other thing. Okay. If it is so consequential, there's a way to do 3 or 4 hearings a day on these generals and admirals and get them a vote in front of the Senate. Some, like, if there truly are some who are, going to serve in the most important leadership billet in the military, then, hey, look, I'm sure, I think Senator Tuberville has said that he'd be willing to, get them a vote, a hearing, and get them on their happy way. But for some reason, there is this desire to maintain a process that removes the ability of congressional consent, removes the ability of any sort of public scrutiny of these military leaders with awesome responsibility. And there's the intense desire to just keep it as fast and seamless as possible so we don't know what's happening right in front of us.
If we take your thesis about what's happened to the military hierarchy as a given, what is the threshold at which the quality of these officers falls off a cliff? What level in the military?
I don't know. It's tough to say. And there are still a lot. I mean, I think the best men that I will ever know are still active duty Army officers. The best bosses I've ever had are probably going to be generals in the next few years. But something is clearly happening. I think, we have to kind of seize control as conservatives of those key benchmarks of a professional officer's development timeline. We need to really scrutinize what service academies look like and what people are learning. How many college professors are we hiring to work there and to teach there? Why can a West Point cadet minor in diversity and inclusion studies? That shouldn't happen. Personally, I think we should give some more consideration to a model like the Brits use, where there's a divorce between a 4-year degree conferring institution and military training, and the 4-year degree happens separately, and then you spend 18 months to 2 years at this place called Sandhurst, where you go through grueling but really excellent military training to serve as an officer. Those are the kinds of things that we have to reclaim as not just institutions unto themselves. Like, I don't know that there's a greater one than West Point, but as marks of formation of the kinds of military officers that we want to be leading troops going forward.
There's been this pretty big pushback that I've been seeing to people wanting their children to serve in the military and that sort of thing. And I think there are a lot of things tied up into it, not just wokeness, but like vaccine mandates and that sort of thing. What would you say to a parent, or someone who's considering joining the military about its future and whether you'd recommend it or not?
If your sons were 16 today, what would be the advice?
Right. I mean, that is the hardest part of this all. Just to lay it out there, I obviously, I would never want my daughters to serve in the military. I don't think that it's the place for women to do that. But if my son asked me in 17 or 18 years, I would do everything I can to prevent him from joining. Kind of lay cards on the table here. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux wrote this letter to the Knights Templar around the time of one of the Crusades, I can't remember. And he explained that if your cause is just, you have nothing to fear, and you can die, in the mantle of Christ with nothing but eternal life to look forward to. But if your cause is not just, no matter how pure your soul, then nothing can save you. And that's my fear. And I think about the kinds of conflicts in which I fought and in which I lost friends. And I don't know how I would continue going on with my life if I lost my son in the sands of the Middle East or the mud of Eastern Europe, knowing that that's not the cause on which his family's life depends. And, much less the fact that, when I see the rainbow flag flying at the embassies of the Vatican and in Germany, I don't want him fighting under that flag. I say that with a lot of remorse because I don't know that there is a better way to become a man than to than to serve in the military, to be bettered by other men around you, and to, like I said, suffer well. But I can figure out another way to get him there and not worry about the cause for which he might give his life.
Will, where can people keep up with everything that the project is doing?
Yeah, look for us on Claremont's website. I'm on Twitter at William Thibeau, and we've put out a lot of things there. But there are good reporters. Mary Margaret Olhan has done great work with us. Michaela Bro at the Daily Caller, and hopefully you see the manifestations of our work in Congress. But we'll have to start by showing the American people what's truly at stake here, because at the end of the day, the Ukraine and Russia have lost about 300,000 men killed in less than a year and a half of war. We lost 10,000 brave Americans in 20 years of conflict. And my concern is that a military that's built on social progressivism and DEI is not going to be a military, and it's not going to be a culture that can sustain those kinds of losses if America is ever in that kind of situation. And if we don't reclaim the military as an institution that can fight for a worthy cause, even if it means that kind of cost, then the future is very dark for America. And so I hope you'll pay attention.
Well, thank you for everything that you do, and thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, gents.
Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. I would highly recommend going to dc.claremont.org and keeping close attention to their work. If you're a Hill staffer listening to this, encourage your bosses to actually put some criticism and deep critical analysis on CQ Brown's nomination. We cannot let these things get rubber stamped. As always, be sure to go to AmericanMoment.org. There you can find everything we have cooking. You can sign up for AM Fridays. You can read AM Canon. You can watch the backlog of this podcast, and you can reach out to us at AmericanMoment.org/join. People are always shocked when they get a response, and I actually meet with them. It's kind of the entire reason we exist. Let's find a way to get you involved. Don't be a couch potato. And as always, be sure to rate and review this podcast, 5 stars only. It really does help us in the rankings. Rate and review it on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hit the bell icon for notifications. I think we're about to hit 2,500 subscribers on YouTube, which is pretty cool. But most of the viewers on there don't actually subscribe. So fix that and do so yourself. And thank you guys, as always, for listening. We will see you next week. Moment of Truth is an American Moment Studios production, filmed at the Conservative Partnership Center. Our podcast is produced and edited by Jake Mercier and Jared Cummings. Our intro music is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich. Don't forget to like and subscribe on all platforms, and you can go to AmericanMoment.org to learn more.